Cold water, volcanic ash, a wooden scraping blade. Spartan soldiers had none of them. Modern professional athletes have all of them and still break down at 35. Roman gladiators trained twice a day under the direct supervision of a doctorus, a specialist trainer, and competed in combat that demanded explosive power, joint stability, and the ability to absorb physical trauma repeatedly across a career that could last a decade or more. They had no compression sleeves, no cryotherapy chambers, no BCAAs or sleep tracking rings. What they had was a recovery system, a specific, structured, daily practice designed not to end pain, but to prevent its accumulation. And that system was sophisticated enough that three completely separate ancient cultures, with no contact with each other, arrived at the same biological conclusions using different tools. Modern sports science has spent 40 years catching up. Most training programs still haven't made it. Here is what the gladiators understood. Here is what two other civilizations confirmed independently. And here is what your training is almost certainly missing: the modern failure. The standard model of athletic recovery goes like this: train hard, rest, eat protein, sleep, repeat. If something hurts, stretch it or ice it. If the fatigue accumulates, take a deload week. If the joint degrades, see a physio. That model produces a predictable result. Men train hard through their 30s, accumulate a slow inventory of small damage: a shoulder that clicks, a knee that stiffens in the morning, a lower back that takes 3 days to recover instead of 1, and conclude that this is what aging feels like. That the decline is physiological inevitability rather than a failure of the system they were following. Here is what the system missed. Recovery is not the absence of training. It is a practice in its own right, with its own mechanics, its own active ingredients, and its own accumulated effect over time. The civilizations that understood this built practitioners who stayed physically capable not just into their 40s, but well past them. 3 of them solved it differently. All 3 arrived at the same biological destination. That convergence is not coincidence. It is evidence. Culture 1. Roman gladiators, 1st to 3rd century CE, Capua and Rome. The Ludus Magnus was the largest and most prestigious gladiatorial training school in the Roman world. Built adjacent to the Colosseum in Rome, it housed and trained the fighters who appeared in the arena, men whose careers depended on remaining physically competitive across years of high-volume, high-intensity training. The doctores who ran gladiatorial conditioning understood something that took modern sports science until the late 20th century to formalize. The tissue damage from training is not the problem. The failure to actively clear that damage between sessions is. Gladiators at the Ludus Magnus followed a daily recovery sequence built around 3 elements. The first was the strigil, a curved iron or bronze scraping blade used after training to remove sweat, oil, and surface debris from the skin. This was not cosmetic. The physical pressure of strigiling, applied across the large muscle groups immediately after exertion, functioned as a systematic soft tissue manipulation, what modern practitioners would recognize as manual myofascial release. The Roman physician Galen of Pergamon, who served as personal physician to the gladiators at Pergamon and documented their training practices in the 2nd century CE, wrote explicitly about the physiological effects of this practice. He described it as essential for preventing what he called the hardening of muscle tissue, the adhesion and reduced tissue mobility that accumulates in undertrained recovery. The second element was thermi-cycling, the structured use of heated and cooled bathing pools. Gladiatorial training facilities maintained dedicated thermi adjacent to the training floor. The sequence was not casual washing. It was deliberate alternation, from the caldarium, the heated pool, to the frigidarium, the cold plunge, repeated in cycles following the training session. What Galen and the Roman training tradition understood empirically, modern vascular physiology has since confirmed mechanically. Thermal cycling drives a pumping effect in the peripheral vasculature, accelerating the clearance of metabolic byproducts from worked tissue and reducing the inflammatory load that accumulates between sessions. The third element was structured unloading. Gladiatorial training schedules reconstructed from the historical record included mandatory light movement days between high-intensity combat training sessions. Not rest, not absence. Active, low-load movement, walking, controlled body weight practice, deliberate joint range work, designed to maintain blood flow and tissue mobility without adding to the damage load. The Roman term for this practice within the conditioning framework was intermissio, not a break from training, but a distinct phase of it. Taken together, these three elements constitute a recovery system with three distinct biological mechanisms: mechanical tissue mobilization, vascular cycling, and active clearance through low-load movement. Modern athletes have access to all three. Most use none of them consistently. Gladiators solved recovery through physical manipulation and thermal mechanics. On the other side of the world, separated by thousands of miles and no shared cultural contact, a completely different civilization arrived at the same biological destination through a fundamentally different door. Culture 2. Japanese sumo, Edo period, 17th to 19th century, Tokyo and the provincial stables. The sumo stable system of the Edo period produced practitioners who competed at elite levels for 20 years or more under conditions of daily physical loading that would end most modern athletic careers within a decade. The rikishi, sumo wrestlers, trained twice daily, absorbed enormous compressive and impact forces across every session, and were expected to remain competitive into their mid-30s and beyond. The recovery practice that made this possible was not passive. It was a formalized system embedded into the daily structure of stable life, and it operated on a completely different biological principle than the Roman approach. The central practice was the butsukari cooldown, a deliberate partner-assisted decompression sequence performed immediately after the intensive morning keiko session. Where the Roman strigil worked on the superficial soft tissue, the butsukari cooldown worked on joint position. The session involved controlled, assisted range of motion work across the major joints: hips, shoulders, lumbar spine, with a training partner providing gentle resistance and guidance through the full available range. The goal was not stretching in the modern sense. It was systematic joint position restoration, returning every major hinge and articulation to its neutral baseline before the tissue cooled and shortened around a compressed, loaded position. The second element was yu-butte, the practice of full body immersion in very hot water, maintained at temperatures between 40 and 44 degrees Celsius for extended periods following the afternoon training session. This is not the same as the Roman thermal cycling. Roman thermae alternated temperatures to drive vascular pumping. Japanese yu-butte used sustained heat specifically to drive what the stable tradition understood as kori otoku, the melting of what they described as knots or accumulations within the muscle tissue. Modern research on prolonged hot water immersion has confirmed the mechanism. Sustained heat at these temperatures reduces muscle spindle sensitivity, allowing chronically contracted tissue to release, and drives a parasympathetic nervous system shift that directly reduces the cortisol load accumulated through high-intensity training. The Edo sumo system was solving a different biological problem than the Roman system. The Romans were clearing damage from tissue that had already been worked. The sumo tradition was preventing the nervous system from locking into a state of chronic activation that would make the following day's training progressively harder to recover from. Two completely different mechanisms. The same outcome: practitioners who stayed capable for decades. Rome solved tissue damage. Japan solved nervous system recovery. There is a third civilization, and what it found has no direct equivalent in either system. It is also the element most completely absent from modern training. Culture 3. Greek pankration athletes. 5th to 2nd century BCE, Olympia and the Pan-Hellenic circuit. Pankration was the most physically comprehensive combat sport in the ancient Greek athletic world, a combination of striking and grappling with almost no restrictions, practiced by athletes who competed across a circuit of festivals including the Olympic Games. Pankration athletes trained under a system managed by the Paido tribes, specialist trainers who held a formal role in Greek civic life and whose methods were documented by Philostratus in his 2nd century CE work on gymnastics. What the Greek pankration system contributed to the recovery question has no parallel in the Roman or Japanese traditions, and it is the element that modern sports science has most recently begun to validate. The Greeks called it anapaysis, a structured period of complete systemic rest embedded by the Paido tribes into the 4-day training cycle. But anapaysis was not simply a day off. It was accompanied by a specific dietary and behavioral protocol designed to actively support what Philostratus described as the restoration of vital heat to the body. This included mandatory exposure to morning sunlight for a minimum period before any food was consumed, a specific meal composition emphasizing easily digestible foods, soft bread, honey, and light broth, consumed in small quantities across the day, and what Philostratus described as deliberate quiet of the mind, a period of non-stimulation that modern neuroscience would recognize as suppression of sympathetic nervous system activity during a recovery window. The mechanism the Greeks were manipulating, without naming it in biological terms, was the hormonal recovery cycle. Sustained training stress elevates cortisol, suppresses testosterone, and downregulates the anabolic signaling cascades that allow muscle tissue to repair and strengthen between sessions. The anapaysis protocol, sunlight exposure, minimal digestive load, enforced nervous system quiet, created the precise hormonal environment in which that repair process could proceed at maximum efficiency. Research published in the Journal of Sports Sciences in 2019 confirmed that hormonal recovery following high-intensity training requires a specific environmental window: low cortisol load, adequate vitamin D precursor exposure, and reduction in stimulation that maintains sympathetic activation. The Greek Paido tribes embedded all three conditions into a formal protocol 2,500 years before the study was run. 3 civilizations, 3 distinct mechanisms: tissue mobilization, nervous system decompression, hormonal restoration. No contact between them. All 3 arrived at the same conclusion: that recovery is not rest. It is an active biological process with specific inputs, and those inputs have to be deliberately provided. Protocol: the modern synthesis. Here is what the 3-system convergence looks like applied to a training week. The Roman layer, tissue mobilization, belongs in the 20 minutes immediately following every training session. You do not need a strigil. You need a foam roller or a lacrosse ball applied systematically across the major muscle groups you just worked, moving from distal to proximal, feet to calves to hamstrings to glutes, or hands to forearms to biceps to shoulders, for 90 seconds per region. This is not stretching. Do not hold positions. Move the tissue. The goal is the same as the strigil: mechanical mobilization of tissue while it is still warm and mobile, before the inflammatory response begins to consolidate. Follow this with 2 minutes of cold water applied to the worked regions. A cold shower directed at the major muscle groups is sufficient. You do not need a cryotherapy chamber. You need thermal contrast. 30 seconds warm, 30 seconds cold, repeated 4 times. This is the frigidarium and caldarium sequence, stripped to its functional minimum. The Japanese layer, nervous system decompression, belongs in the hour following the end of your training session. During this window, your goal is to actively drive a parasympathetic shift. The most accessible tool is 10 minutes of controlled breathing. 4-count inhale, hold for 4, 8-count exhale, which has been shown in peer-reviewed literature to reduce cortisol levels measurably within a single session. If you have access to a hot bath at 40 degrees Celsius or above, 20 minutes of immersion in this window compounds the effect. If not, the breathing protocol alone produces the nervous system shift the sumo tradition was targeting. The Greek layer, hormonal restoration, belongs on your lowest training intensity day of the week. This is not a day off from movement. It is a day structured around recovery inputs. 10 to 20 minutes of direct sunlight exposure within the first 2 hours of waking. A reduced volume, easily digestible first meal eaten only after that sun exposure, and a deliberate reduction of high stimulation inputs. No high-intensity media, no caffeine beyond a single morning dose for the first half of the day. These are not wellness suggestions. They are the specific conditions under which your cortisol cycle resets and your anabolic hormones have space to rise. Together, these 3 layers take less than 40 minutes per training day and 1 structured low-intensity day per week. The gladiators, the sumo practitioners, and the Greek pankration athletes had no agreement about how recovery worked. They simply applied it consistently, and stayed capable for far longer than their modern equivalents. The convergence. 3 civilizations, no contact, the same conclusion. Recovery is not passive. It is a biological practice with specific active ingredients: tissue mobilization, nervous system decompression, hormonal restoration, and the absence of any one of those ingredients produces a predictable result. You have seen that result. The shoulder that doesn't fully clear between sessions, the accumulated fatigue that sits in the legs 3 days after a hard training day, the slow narrowing of what your body can do, attributed to age, when the real attribution is a recovery system that was never complete. The gladiators called the scraping blade essential. The sumo masters built the hot bath into the architecture of the stable. The Greek trainers encoded the anapaysis into the 4-day cycle as a formal requirement. None of them were being cautious. They were being precise. Hard is easy to find. Precise is what lasts.